Gadigal land where I live, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So it's a very special evening tonight, deep listening in the natural world, science and faith in interactive dialogue, with nature sound recordist Andrew Skeoch, and contributions tonight from a diversity of faith perspectives, and from you also. There'll be opportunities to share together. Yes, as we start tonight, we're going to have a land, fire and water ceremony. Lisa Buxton, Executive Officer of Aboriginal Catholic Ministry in Sydney. She's an educator with tertiary qualifications and experience in informing Australian teachers about Aboriginal ways of seeing and being. So together with other members of the ministry at La Perouse, Lisa is going to lead us in acknowledging country with this land, fire and water ceremony.
Creator Spirit, you gave us this Mother Earth to share. Humble us with the grace to listen with open hearts to country and to the story of others. Unite us all who drink the same water and breathe the same air, and for this we pray. Our ancestors' footprints are imprinted on country. For tens of thousands of years before recorded time, our people have walked on this land, on their own country to which they belong. Our relationship with the land is at the centre of our lives. Our country is our mother. In a sense, our country is us. We listen to country, speak to country, dance and sing up country, care for country, visit country, and long for country. Country is lived on and lived with. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and thank them for passing on their knowledge, our language, and spiritual connections to country.
Fire is important to our people. We could not do without it. Fire means the calling of our people together, providing warmth, to share a meal, gathering for ceremonies, gathering for storytelling, a place to be together and share the warm fire with another. Smoke from a fire can also be used to cleanse our spirit.
Water is connected to Mother Earth and to Father Sky. Water is also important to our people. In the driest part of the driest country, water is life-giving, refreshing, cooling, and cleansing to our country and to us. We have a spiritual and customary living relationship with water in all its forms. If we were all able to physically take part in this ceremony, this is where we would invite you to touch Mother Earth, to immerse your hands in the water and feel the warmth of our fire. Giriambunu, Baigalnaya, Yingani, Yaganda, Bayanu. As we come together, let us have a sense of the importance of country upon which you are sitting. Country is filled with relations speaking language and following law, no matter their form. May we walk thoughtfully and gently on country, remembering the footsteps of our ancestors that walked before us and those who will follow us. We invite you to take a moment and reflect on the importance of land, fire and water for your own expression of spirit.
It's my great pleasure now to introduce our keynote presenter, Andrew Skeoch. Andrew is from Central Victoria. He's an educator, naturalist, environmental thinker, and one of Australia's best known nature sound recordists. This evening, Andrew's going to encourage us to listen and engage personally with nature and guide us in our listening. We're going to hear from him a couple of times throughout the event. Later on, you're going to have an opportunity to ask him some questions. But for now, we welcome you, Andrew. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone, and for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. It's a great honour. And I'm joining you from Djadjarung country in central Victoria, in southern temperate Australia. And I'll let the country introduce itself shortly. But I'd just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people that have looked after this land for so many generations and have never ceded that custodianship and continue it to this day. I feel as a white fella, I have a lot to learn. I'd like to begin with a story, and this goes back to when I first started nature sound recording, maybe coming up on 30 years ago now. And myself and my partner Sarah were recording in outback Australia, and we were offered the opportunity, the invitation to come out on country with an Aboriginal man named Harold. And not having had an awful lot of contact with Aboriginal people to that point in our lives, we really leapt at the opportunity and found ourselves in a rattly old four-wheel drive, going through the sandhill country on this windy rutted out track through the mulga scrub until we eventually arrived at a point where this low range of hills came down to the sand plains and a gorge opened out. And we stopped and we got out of the car and Harold turned off the engine and the silence was just palpable. And I found myself just listening and absorbing where I was and noticing things. And Harold said to us, we're just going to sit here quietly for a little while. He said, we're not going to move, we're just going to sit quietly. Maybe you'd like to go and sit on those rocks over there. And I said, that's great, because it'd be nice to get the sound of the car out of my ears and just give me an opportunity to be quiet and still and tune into the bush. And he looked at me a bit funny and then he laughed and he just said, no, mate, no, that's not why we do this. And I was a bit puzzled and I said, I don't understand. And he said, no, this is not time for you to tune into the bush. It's time for the bush to tune into you. Find out what kind of character you are. Find out what kind of person you are. Find out whether you can be trusted, because if you can, nature will start opening itself to you, start revealing itself to you, and start talking to you. And at the time I thought, that is such a lyrical, poetic, beautiful sentiment. I didn't realize that at the time that he meant it pretty literally. And what I want to talk to you about this afternoon is my interpretation of that relationship with nature through listening and through engaging. And I suppose the first question is, why listening? What is so important about listening? You know, when we listen to each other, particularly somebody who doesn't have the same life experience as you, they have a different ideology, different beliefs, to really listen to them deeply has been termed a radical act. And if that's so, then listening to nature, to all the other life around us, you know, we live so much of our life within this kind of this human bubble. I call it the anthrosphere. And to listen to life around us is an order of magnitude more radical again, because we don't really have the skills to do it. Our distant ancestors knew how to do it because it was survival for them. But living in urban environments, surrounded by technology and by the sort of voices of our own creations, cultural and so on, we've really got out of the habit. So for me, listening is really important in this sense. And this I think is the crucial thing. When you listen to somebody who has a different experience, different viewpoint, and you really take on what they are saying. It is firstly an act of respect. But the key element in that is that you open yourself and you allow yourself to be influenced by what you're hearing. That you allow yourself in some way to be changed. And this is the quality of listening that I want to suggest. That we listen to nature in the sense that we are listening to not only to hear and understand and appreciate what's going on around us, to use our senses in that way, but to allow that experience to change us deeply as living creatures on this wonderful planet, a part of this biosphere. So let's begin with some listening. And I'm just going to share screen. Bear with me half a second. So as well as getting us listening, this gives me the opportunity to talk to you about spectrograms, or introduce spectrograms. They're a visual representation of what we're hearing, where time is displayed horizontally along the bottom, and the frequency of sound in hertz is displayed vertically from very low sounds at the bottom to high sounds, possibly beyond the range of our hearing at the top. And the intensity of sound at a particular frequency and time is shown by the brightness of the plot. So this is a recording, just a little over a minute or so. It was recorded on our land here. And as you listen, see if you can synchronize what you're hearing with what the spectrogram is showing you. Okay, here we go. How did you go on that? I love spectrograms. They're just so, they give you an insight into what you're hearing. When I first began recording and really listening to the natural world, I'd grown up in Sydney, one of the major metropolises in the Southern Hemisphere, but I'd always had a love of the bush and spent a lot of my childhood in the Blue Mountains bushwalking, or Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park or something like this. So I knew my birds, but to actually hear them and to start associating with sound and different species was quite a revelation. And I guess this is where we have to begin, is identifying sounds and naming the different species, recognizing them by their sounds. But as you begin doing this, you realize different species have sounds. They don't just have one sound, they have a whole range of sounds, and that these sounds are referenced to their behaviors. So there are sounds that are to do with where they live, their home range that they live in. There are sounds that are social. There are sounds that are warnings and alarms. There are sounds to keep in contact if you're a flocking bird, for instance. So there are a lot of different behavioural associations of sounds. Now, as a biologist, that's where one would start to decode the language of nature. And it was many years and I'm just going to skip through a couple of slides here because normally, by the way, this is the species that you've just heard, 16 species of birds, one frog and a bush fly. And normally I would go through and I would show you what all these are and just talk a little bit about why these species use the sounds that they do. But we might have to hold that for another occasion. For many years I thought of it like this. And then one day, I don't know what it was, but I just had a different perception. I suddenly realized that I'm hearing other living creatures. I'm hearing their presence in the world. It's similar to when we hear each other's voices. We hear something of our character, something of our spirit, and you can hear that in the voices of living creatures. So what you're actually hearing is not the creature or a particular species or a behavior. You're hearing sentience. You're hearing intelligence. You're hearing mind. This can be a difficult concept to get hold of, but I just want to give you some quick examples. This is a Teresian crow. It's a highly intelligent bird. It's known to be a very fine problem solver. It's a social bird. And this particular crow is trying to work out what species would, the intelligence rate that sticks a fork in a fence. On this occasion, when I was recording them, I would put the microphones out once again in Central Australia, and I'd find that the crows had come around at some point. Like what I often do is I leave the microphones out in the field on a tripod with the recorder there, and I'll record for several hours. And I'd come back and get it, and I'd find that the crows had been hanging around the mics. They come to investigate every morning, and I'd sort of hear them flying in and calling and so on. But on this particular occasion, a crow did something really quite extraordinary. So what you'll hear is the bird flies in, gives a couple of calls from a few meters away, and then it hops along the ground. I can almost imagine this, and sitting right underneath the tripod, underneath the microphone. And then it starts vocalizing. I feel that you can hear this bird's curiosity, and you can also hear its disappointment. Nothing to nothing to see here, move along. And then it calls out to its extended family members, and you know. It's easy to, when you're thinking like this, to consider that this is kind of anthropocentric, and I don't mean it to sound like that. I think there's a fine line between projecting oneself and actually feeling empathy for another creature, and it's important to realize that crows live in the same world that we do, and their minds, or the architecture of their mind, is not that much different to ours. So for them to have the same mental processes is not at all, that shouldn't be a difficult thing to accept. I just want to play you another quick recording. This is another outback denizen. This is a magpie. And the thing to notice is this phoneme here in the middle. If you just listen carefully. I don't know whether you caught that, but what it's doing in the middle of its normal warbling song, with all its complexity, it's throwing in an imitation of a wild horse. And the fact that birds play with sound like this, to me, is just so delightful. There are many birds that mimic not only other bird species, but things like this. I've heard bowerbirds imitating the tinkle of coins, for instance. So once again, we're hearing another creature playing with the elements of its environment, its sonic environment.
Andrew, it's Miriam here. We've had a couple of requests on the chat to just hear that one again, if we might.
Sure, I'd love to. Here we go. Isn't that great? So what we're surrounded by is not other creatures and species and Latin names and so on. We're surrounded by living things, and you can hear them. And the thing about sound is that it tells you what's happening. Just by standing in a woodland or wherever you are, you can hear creatures, you can understand what they're doing, what their interactions, their communications. Once again, we're kind of looking at individual creatures. And there was a moment where I realized, no, hang on a sec, this is bigger than this. I'm actually hearing an entire ecosystem. And the place that this dawned on me was the rainforests of Sulawesi in the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. It's a densely rainforested equatorial island. And I'd go out recording with my microphones in the morning, and there were times when it was just the biodiversity, it was extraordinary, the acoustic diversity as well. But there'd be other times when it was really quiet in the forest. And I'd know that all this biodiversity was around me, but I just wasn't hearing very much. And then one bird would fly in and land and begin vocalizing quietly. And a few minutes later, another one would come in, and then another one. And within a few minutes, the forest is just full of birdsong. Everywhere you look, there is movement. There are birds coming through the undergrowth and going up branches and tree trunks, and every leaf seems to have a bird hanging off it. Now, this is a phenomenon that you find particularly in tropical forests. It's called a mixed species feeding flocks, and they can be quite an extraordinary thing to witness. Several dozen species, possibly hundreds of birds, all moving through the forest together. And when I was in India, they also have these mixed species flocks. And I was speaking with Indian ornithologists, and they said the thing that they've noticed is that the first bird that flies in, that first one that flies in and lands and starts vocalizing, it's very often this species. It's a racket-tailed drongo, and you can just see the rackets hanging off the bottom of its outer tail feathers there. It's a spectacular bird, but what its greatest skill is in mimicry. It's a fantastic mimic. It's kind of like the Indian lyrebird in a way. And what these ornithologists were saying was that what they were considering was that when the racket-tail flies in and sings and calls the other birds, it acts a little bit like the Pied Piper. It draws this flock of birds through the forest with it, and the integrity of the whole flock is maintained by all those contact calls that you've just heard. And I thought, the kind of the hairs went up the back of my neck, because what I realized, the implications on this are vast. Not only are you talking about a multi-species cooperative behavior, which is all facilitated by sound, but mixed species feeding flocks don't just occur in tropical forests. I have them here in Victoria, particularly in the winter season. You get little groups of thornbills and whistlers and maybe a thrush, tree creepers, a robin or two, and exactly the same thing. So this behavior, this cooperative behavior, has to be deeply embedded in the evolutionary story of not just a couple of birds, but birds as a whole class of animals in the avian story. And that got me thinking about, well, where else can I hear cooperation on this kind of deep evolutionary level, where you hear sound actually working in a kind of an orchestrated cooperative way. And to me, the obvious example was the dawn chorus. Now, when we hear the dawn chorus, we hear a massive bird song that all starts in the dark and continues on as the light rises. But if you listen carefully, and particularly if you focus in on a particular bird where there's, you know, a couple of individuals in the landscape, you'll hear them doing something that's called counter singing. They don't sing over the top of each other, they alternate their songs backwards and forwards. And this is one of my favorite examples of this behavior. This is a white-fronted honeyeater. It's another outback bird. I just love outback birdsong. The white-fronted honeyeater I think of as the pinball machine bird, because it has the most extraordinary vocalizations, sort of pinging, ricocheting, bell-like calls. So on this recording, if you've got stereo headphones, if it's broadcasting in stereo, okay, I hope it is. What you may hear is these two birds calling, and you'll hear them creating this tightly interlocking pattern, temporal pattern, where the sounds ricochet almost backwards and forwards between the two birds. Now, this isn't accidental. This is a behavior, I suppose, but it speaks of almost a culture of birds, because once again, the dawn chorus is deeply embedded in the avian DNA. Songbirds have been around for maybe 30 million years, so that's probably how long the dawn chorus has been happening. And as you listen to all the different birds singing, you realize they're doing this. I think of it as essentially respectful. It has to work by listening and responding and recognizing each other. So it's a process of recognition of the bird's neighbors and the place that it inhabits within the landscape, its home range. And it's not just heard at dawn. This is a golden whistler. And on this occasion, I was walking through fairly dense temperate rainforest, big tree ferns coming down on either side of the track. And I came across two male golden whistlers, one on one side of the track and the other one on the other, and they were both singing and they were both displaying. And by that I mean that they kind of fluffed their feathers out, particularly the yellow feathers, and their tails were cocked, and they were really doing a dance as well as the song. And I realized that the track must be a kind of natural demarcation between their two home ranges. And once again, I mean, during the day, golden whistlers have a particular song that's quite melodic. It often has a little whip at the end of it. But on this occasion, they had a slightly different repertoire. It was much more subdued, more intimate, I'd say. But once again, you can hear that they've not only matched that repertoire, so they're both singing the same song, but they're doing this alternation, this counter singing. So what I feel that we're hearing here in these examples of the way that birds sing is that they're minimizing the damaging effects of competition. Rather than confront each other physically, aggressively, they're using song to negotiate their relationships. And the more I explore this concept of minimization of competition rather than actually accentuating competition, the more I consider that we've actually kind of got the shoe on the wrong foot when we think that competition runs natural systems. I think essentially this is a kind of colonial idea. So it got me thinking about how do natural systems sort of self-regulate and self-perpetuate. And this minimization of competition is one aspect of it that you hear so strongly in birds because that's the way that they do it. But for a lot of creatures in an ecosystem, they will exist without, even though they utilize the same resources, they'll do so without necessarily competing over those resources. And it's a process I think of as mutual accommodation. And the whole soundscape is a kind of a space, the acoustic space, if you like, is a place where creatures can come together and vocalize, to hear and be heard, and they share that acoustic space rather than competing over it. If you listen to this soundscape, you'll hear birds coming and going. Yes, they're all calling at the same time, but there's a sense of sharing this acoustic space. This particular recording comes from the cloud forests in Papua New Guinea, and you'll hear birds like jewel babblers, birds of paradise, ground robins, lorikeets, whistlers. So you can hear this, but it's also fairly evident to observe. There are many occasions where you see animals living side by side, sharing the same resources without being competitive about it. And these are situations where creatures are utilizing the same resources. In many cases, what we find is that particularly in developed ecosystems, ones that have reached a degree of maturity, there are processes that are called mutualisms, where there are cooperative processes that lie at the absolute core of the way that an ecosystem functions. So for instance, the relationship between mycorrhizal algae and a lot of plants, 90% of plants rely on mycorrhizal algae to extract nutrients and moisture from the soil. Pollinators for flowers, insects and birds, sometimes other animals, mammals, small Australian mammals, sometimes gliders, possums. Our gut flora, you know, the microorganisms and bacteria in our guts. This is all mutualistic relationships without which we simply can't survive. So nature at its core involves cooperative processes. And I just want to let you actually hear one. In coral reefs, there is the fundamental mutualistic relationship is between the coral and algae. But there is a creature called a snapping shrimp, or sometimes a pistol shrimp. They're ubiquitous in the world's oceans, and they have a specially adapted pincer that they snap together. It creates a little air bubble, and when that air bubble pops, it creates a shock wave, and they stun their prey with it. So when you hear snapping shrimp, which you do all around the world, as soon as you go snorkeling or swimming, you put your head underwater and you hear this crackle, this marine crackle. It's just a multitude of snapping shrimp. The interesting thing is, they have a mutualistic relationship with the coral, where the coral provide them with shelter and the shrimp protect the coral from predators like starfish. Also, the shrimp have a mutualistic relationship with particular species of rainforest, or sorry, reef fish. And in this recording, you'll not only hear all the snapping shrimp, but if you listen carefully, you'll hear fish creating little grunting and popping sounds. And fish actually have a dawn chorus, the same as birds do. This was recorded just before sunrise at Ningaloo Reef. So a soundscape like this represents the kind of mutually beneficial relationships that lie at the absolute core of some of the world's ecosystems. So avoidance of competition, minimization of competition, ritual behaviors that bypass competitive interactions, mutual accommodation, and then the kind of cooperation which is absolutely fundamental to the functioning of ecosystems and often very deeply embedded in the evolutionary story of our planet. All of these tell me about the way that nature functions. And I just want to finish off by mentioning the work of New York, I'm not sure whether he's a philosopher or a professor, but anyway, he's written a book recently called Finite and Infinite Games, in which he suggests that there are at least two games, finite and infinite. So the finite game is played for a winner. There might be many losers, but there is a winner. And you recognize who the winner is through the process of the game, which is played by a strict set of rules and boundaries. By contrast, the infinite game is played for the continuance of the game itself. And the rules of the game are played with, and the boundaries are played with. And, you know, it'd be easy to analogize this with nature and say, well, you know, there are winners and losers in the evolutionary game with nature too. You know, it's the same as the kind of games that we play, for instance. As soon as you know, whenever you see a sportsman holding up the trophy or the politician on election night pumping their fists in the air, or a corporate executive announcing their year's profits, you're hearing the outcomes of the finite game. But here's the thing. The finite game requires an audience, because otherwise who's going to recognize who the winners and losers are? But the infinite game, the game that is played for its own continuance, is engaged in by participants. So I think of nature not only as the infinite game, this game of sustainability, but the biodiversity that results from this it's the outcome of the infinite game, in which life plays with the rules of survival through adaptation and the process of evolution. It's playing with what's possible in survival, and it's coming up with the most extraordinary sort of life stories and adaptations in various creatures that are all adapted to survive in their own particular way, and very often interactively, as we've seen with mutualisms and cooperation. And the whole purpose of it is to ensure its continuance. And here we are, roughly 4 billion years after the first building blocks of life emerged. Life is still continuing. And I feel that for us as living creatures, at this point in our development, we need to think very clearly about the kind of competitive games that we base our societies on, and start thinking about how to play the infinite game and to take our role in the continuance of life on this planet. Thank you very much. I shall leave it there, for the moment at least.
We have a short time for Andrew to respond to some of your questions. Andrew, are you there?
I am indeed.
See you,
yes.
Great.
Oh, amazing questions. Wow.
They are amazing. I just wanted to ask one that I've seen from a few groups, which is, how do you make a shallow listener into a deep listener? How do we encourage this, and what difference does it make anyway?
I don't really know the answer to this. I wish I did, but there are a couple of thoughts that come off the top of my head. Showing somebody the wonder of something that they hadn't noticed before, and particularly a young person, it can open up something marvelous. So I think simply demonstrating, which is education, I suppose, is a part of it. But the other question, and this is something I don't have an answer for, but I suppose it's my own question, is the degree to which we have differences in sensitivity. That some of us are intensely sensitive to the world, almost as a part of our nature. It's sometimes almost painfully overwhelming, that sensitivity and that moral sense. Other people just don't seem to have it. And I think we need to accept that this is a part of the continuum of human presence in the world, that some people just don't seem to have that depth of sensitivity, and it may be simply biological. It may be part of the differences, the spectrum, I suppose, of our own. Yeah.
Thank you.
So maybe actually trying to do that is an effort that maybe doesn't need to be done. That maybe those people fit into the world in a different way. There are some people that are sensitive and can lead and realise the connections and relationships, and there are other people that are just, no, give me a job, I'll just get out there and do it. So.
Thanks, Andrew. There were several questions, I think, related. When you started talking, you said when you first went out on country, and the fellow that you were with said, this is not about you tuning in, it's about this place tuning into you and checking you out. There are a few questions saying, what evidence has there been, or how have you noticed birds and other creatures impact your presence impacting on them, how they've changed in response to your presence? And others, there's another question as well about I guess aquatic ecology, and how the presence of human presence might have impacted there as well. But yes, how the environment and how the creatures there have responded to your presence when recording.
That's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because so much of it is interpretation. And I think my answer to that would be to step back from it and say, does it really matter? Because the essence of what I was getting at is how you change by what you do, by your engagement. It's not whether nature changes in response to you. And it's something that I've seen time and time again. You see this all over social media, is that people put up videos, oh, isn't it cute what this animal's doing? Isn't it lovely what this animal's doing? Or something like this. And it's very much, we're projecting ourselves onto nature and our pets and what we think's going on out there. And I guess what I'm actually trying to do the opposite of not project myself, not see the influence that I might be having, or see nature as a mirror of who I am, but try to sensitize myself to nature and allow it to influence me, to change, to give me a new I don't know. It's difficult to put into words. You know it when it happens. It's just, there's an allowing and an honouring and respect.
Andrew, we just have one more minute before we go to the other faith responses, but could you tell us an answer to the question about, say, the noisy miner, some of the voices that we don't really want to hear?
Yeah, no, this is a great one. There are a couple of things. I once listened to a PhD researcher talking about noisy miners. They are the most fascinating creatures. Their social interactions, a lot of it vocal, the way that they work together as a group, they are the most spectacularly cooperative animals. And the thing is, they recognize each other by their voices. They have particular calls for different predators. There's a lot of intelligence there. The interesting thing about them is that they have these mobbing calls, and what they're doing is they're saying, no, look, this is our patch, please go away. And they're being a bit obnoxious, but they're not actually being aggressive. If you watch them, they won't go in and peck something, for instance. So they're adaptive species, they're generalists, which means that they are excellent at occupying lands that have been disturbed. So when we create suburbs, along come noisy miners because they can survive in our suburbs and make it their homes. A lot of other birds simply can't, other creatures can't. So in biology, they're called colonizer species, but I'm not really very happy with that word. They're kind of the species that comes in and tries to adapt to a changed environment, and from them grows a whole lot of other species, you know. The other thing I'd say about noisy miners is if you listen to their dawn calls, they are beautiful. They are sublime. The whole group of birds up and down the street or something will all sing, and they just have these beautiful songs. If you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and listen to them, you'll have a different sense of what noisy miners are.